She was 19 years old. She had just finished her first year of nursing school, and on the warm evening of June 14th, 1991, she walked out of a roller rink in Cedar Falls, Oregon, told her friends she'd catch the next ride, and was never seen alive again. That is not a story about a girl who ran off into the night. That is a story about a quiet town that held a secret for 34 years, and about the one man who knew exactly what happened and said nothing every single day for the rest of his ordinary life. It would take a discarded soda can, a genealogist who refused to quit, and a knock on a door in 2025 that a whole family never saw coming. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to that summer evening, to the lights of the roller rink and the smell of the river. Because to understand what was buried, you first have to understand who Rachel Dorr was. Cedar Falls was a mill town wrapped in green, 3,000 people tucked into a bend of the Santiam River, where the timber trucks rolled through at dawn, and the whole valley smelled of cut fir and wet stone. In 1991, it was the kind of place where the high school parking lot doubled as the social center of the county, where kids cruised the main drag on Friday nights, with the windows down and a cassette in the deck, where everybody's parents knew everybody else's by name and by truck. The mill still ran 3 shifts, and you could set your watch by the whistle. The drive in 2 towns over was still open. The diner on Main kept a jar of free peppermints by the register and a pot of coffee that never went cold. People left their screen doors unlatched against the summer heat and trusted that the worst thing that might wander in was a raccoon or somebody's loose dog. It was a town that believed, the way these towns do, that real danger lived somewhere else, in the cities, on the late news, far from the river and the fur and the sound of the mill. Rachel Dorr had grown up in that valley, the youngest of 3 and the only girl, doted on by 2 older brothers and a father who ran the parts counter at the hardware store and could find any bolt in any bin blindfolded. She was bright and stubborn and kind in the particular way of people who feel everything a little too much. She'd made it into the nursing program at the community college on her own grades and her own grit, the first in her family to go past high school, and she came home that first summer full of plans, talking about working in a children's ward someday, practicing taking her own pulse at the kitchen table. She drove a rust-colored Datsun she'd bought with her own money from 2 years of waitressing at the diner. She wore a thin silver bracelet her grandmother had given her on her 16th birthday and never took it off, not to sleep, not to shower. And she had a habit of humming when she was nervous, a tuneless little melody with no song behind it, something her mother could hear drifting from the next room. Her mother, Joan, used to say she could find Rachel anywhere in the house just by standing still and listening for it. Nobody knew yet how long that silence would last once the humming stopped for good. That June, Rachel had been happier than anyone had seen her in years. She'd reconnected with old friends. She talked about transferring to a bigger program in Portland in the fall. She'd started a journal she kept hidden under her mattress, the way 19-year-olds do. That warm evening at the roller rink, laughing under the colored lights with girls she'd known since grade school, was the last time anyone who loved her would see her whole. On the night of June 14th, the roller rink closed at 10 p.m. Rachel's friends offered her a ride home, but she waved them off, said she'd wait for someone, said it with a small private smile that none of them thought to question at the time. At 10:15, a car hop at the burger stand across the road saw her standing near the edge of the lot, alone, under the buzzing neon, her arms crossed against the cooling night. At 10:40, the same car hop looked again, and the spot was empty. Rachel's rust-colored Datsun was still parked where she'd left it. By midnight, when she hadn't come home, Joan stood at the kitchen window and listened for the hum of an engine in the drive, the way she'd listened for that girl her whole life. It never came. By 1 a.m., she woke Rachel's father. By 2 a.m., he and both brothers were driving the dark county roads with the windows down, calling her name into the wall of trees, headlights sweeping the ditches. Her car sat in the roller rink lot for 3 days before anyone in authority would call it anything more than a teenage girl who'd taken off on her own. The driver's door was unlocked. Her purse was gone. But on the passenger seat, fallen down into the crease where the cushion met the back, was her grandmother's silver bracelet, the one she never took off. Its clasp snapped clean. A girl does not leave that behind. For 34 years, nobody would understand what that broken clasp was trying to say. The county sheriff's office took the report on the 4th day, and even then, reluctantly, with a deputy who told Joan that girls Rachel's age ran off all the time and usually turned up. Joan knew her daughter. Rachel had not run. The detective assigned was a man named Gil Marsh, 38, lean and soft-spoken, a transplant from Salem who'd come to Cedar Falls for the quiet and gotten the worst case of his career instead. Marsh did what he could with what 1991 gave him. He combed the roller rink lot. He took the bracelet into evidence, photographed the broken clasp, and wrote in his notes that a girl who never removed it would not have left it behind willingly. He canvassed the burger stand, the main drag, the mill gates at shift change. He believed from early on that Rachel had not run, that she'd been waiting that night for someone she knew and trusted, someone whose presence wouldn't have alarmed her friends, someone she'd kept a secret. But belief is not evidence. And in 1991, in a town that didn't want to believe one of its own could be responsible, belief was all Gil Marsh had. He looked first at a boyfriend, a mill worker named Dale, a few years older than Rachel, and held him for questioning twice. Dale had an alibi that mostly held, a poker game with witnesses, though there was a gap of an hour nobody could account for. Marsh never liked him for it, not fully, but he could never clear him either. And the suspicion poisoned Dale's life in Cedar Falls until he left for good. The whole time, the answer was closer than Dale, closer than anyone wanted to look. While Marsh chased the leads he was allowed to chase, Joan Dorr did the only thing a mother could. She made flyers on the copy machine at the library and stapled them to every telephone pole from Cedar Falls to the county line. She kept Rachel's room exactly as it was, the bed made, the nursing textbooks stacked on the desk, the journal still hidden underneath the mattress where no one thought to look. She left the porch light on every single night, because Rachel had once said as a child that a porch light meant somebody was waiting for you. Joan would leave that light burning for 34 years. There was one lead that haunted Gil Marsh to the end. A neighbor mentioned, almost in passing, that Rachel had seemed close that spring with a family friend, an older man who helped out around the Dorr house, a man everyone trusted completely. Marsh noted it. But the man was beloved, was practically family, was the last person anyone in Cedar Falls would suspect, and a supervisor told Marsh to stop chasing shadows and stop upsetting good people. The thread was never pulled. It would sit untouched in the file for 3 decades, the truth folded inside it the whole time. By the winter of 1992, the case was cold. There was no body. There was no scene but a parked car and a broken bracelet. There was a detective who believed the answer was a face the town saw every week, and no way on earth to prove it. By 1996, 5 years had passed. Rachel's brothers grew into men and moved away one by one, unable to bear the porch light or the unhummed silence of the house. The oldest took a job in Idaho and rarely came back. The younger one stopped speaking of his sister at all, the grief gone underground in him. Their father, the man who'd taught Rachel to drive in the hardware store lot, died in 2001 of a stroke that Joan always said started the night Rachel didn't come home. Joan buried him alone, with the boys flown in for a single gray afternoon, and then she kept the light burning. The roller rink shut down in the late 90s when the kids stopped coming. The floor that had glowed under all those colored lights gone dark, and the building became a feed store. Then nothing at all. Its painted sign fading to a ghost above the door. The mill cut back to one shift, then closed for good, and Cedar Falls began the slow emptying that timber towns across the Northwest know too well, storefronts going dark one at a time down Main. By 2011, 20 years had passed. The car hop who'd seen Rachel under the neon that night was a grandmother now, and she still teared up if anyone mentioned it. The girls who'd offered Rachel a ride home had children of their own as old as Rachel had ever gotten to be. Gil Marsh retired in 2009, but before he turned in his badge, he photocopied the entire door file and kept it in a banker's box in his hall closet, and he read through it most winters, with a cup of coffee going cold beside him. He'd circled that one untouched lead, the older family friend, in red pen, and beside it he'd written a single word: who. He never stopped wondering. And Joan, in her 70s now, still kept Rachel's room exactly as it had been in June of 1991. The bed made, the nursing textbooks squared on the desk, the journal still hidden under the mattress, where no one had thought to look. She still left the porch light on every night without fail. She still sometimes caught herself going quiet in a doorway, out of an old reflex 30 years deep, listening for a tuneless little hum from the next room that would never come again. Every case like this one represents weeks of digging through old records, verifying facts, and trying to do right by families who waited far too long for the truth. If stories like Rachel's matter to you, take a second to subscribe and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. It honestly helps these cases reach the people who still remember the names. Now, let's get back to Cedar Falls. The case had been cold for 33 years when a young cold case investigator named Dawn Petrock found it. Petrock had been hired in 2024 as part of a state initiative to apply genetic genealogy to Oregon's oldest unsolved disappearances, and she went looking through the dustiest files first. The door case stopped her, because almost everything about it screamed that Rachel had known her abductor, and almost nothing had ever been tested. There was no body. But there was the bracelet, and on the bracelet's broken clasp, preserved in an evidence envelope for 33 years, a 1991 note in Gil Marsh's careful hand recorded a tiny smudge of what might be skin or blood, snagged when the clasp tore. Never analyzed, because the technology to analyze it would not exist for another generation. Petrock drove out to a small house at the edge of Salem to find Gil Marsh, now 71, gray and stooped, but with eyes that sharpened the moment she said Rachel's name. She told him she wanted to test the clasp. The old detective was quiet for a long moment, and then he went to a closet and came back with his own photocopied file, the lead circled in red, the single word who. Beside it. I always thought she was waiting for someone that night, he said. Someone she'd have walked right up to. I just never got to find out who. They sent the clasp to a forensic lab built for exactly this kind of work. The smudge gave up a partial male DNA profile, badly degraded, the kind of trace that would have been worthless even 15 years before. But modern genetic genealogy doesn't need a pristine sample, and it doesn't need the suspect to be sitting in a criminal database. Explained as plainly as it can be, it takes whatever genetic markers survive, searches the millions of ordinary people who've uploaded their DNA to public ancestry sites hoping to find a long-lost cousin, identifies the suspect's relatives among them, and then builds a family tree inward until only one person can possibly fit. A genealogist named Marion Holt took the profile and began the slow, patient work, building outward from third and fourth cousins, cross-referencing more than a century of census records, faded obituaries, and county marriage licenses spread in stacks across her dining room table. Some nights she worked until 2 a.m, chasing a single surname down a dead branch, only to start over. It took her 9 weeks. The tree narrowed to one family rooted for generations right there in the Santiam Valley, then to a single household on a single road, then, by age and geography, and a process of careful elimination, to one man. When Holt finally sent the name to Petrock in the early spring of 2025, Petrock read it on her screen and felt the floor tilt under her. Because the name was not new to the case at all. It was already in the file. It was in Gil Marsh's 34-year-old notes. It was the lead a supervisor had told him to drop. It was circled in red, with that one word beside it. Who? The name belonged to a man named Howard Linley. In 1991, Howard Linley had been a 44-year-old handyman and a fixture in the Dorr family's life. The trusted older friend who fixed their fences and fixed their cars and stayed for Sunday dinner. The man Rachel had known since she was a little girl. The man so woven into the family that no one had ever thought to look at him twice. He had helped staple Joan's flyers to the telephone poles. He had sat at her kitchen table in the worst weeks and held her hand. He had been a pallbearer at Rachel's father's funeral. And in 2025, Howard Linley was 78 years old, a widower, a great-grandfather, a deacon at the Cedar Falls Church, beloved by everyone who knew him. Petrock pulled Rachel's hidden journal from the evidence archive, the one Joan had finally surrendered to investigators years earlier, and read it again with new eyes. The secret Rachel had carried that spring, the someone she'd smiled about waiting for, the relationship she'd told no friend and no parent, was sketched in its pages in a teenager's careful, frightened handwriting. She had trusted him. She had thought, in the way of a sheltered 19-year-old, that it was something other than what it was. And on the night of June 14th, she had waved off a safe ride home to wait, alone under the neon, for a man the whole town would have sworn was harmless. The broken clasp told the rest. She had not gone quietly. Investigators recovered a discarded soda can from Howard Linley's curbside trash and confirmed it. The Dina on the bracelet was his. The 34 years of silence had a name. They arrested Howard Linley on a gray morning in the spring of 2025, on the porch of the same house he'd lived in for half a century. He did not seem surprised. He set down his coffee and held out his hands, and a neighbor watering her garden across the street dropped her hose and stood frozen. This was the man who'd led the Sunday school picnic. This was the man who fixed widows' furnaces for free. When the truth moved through Cedar Falls that the person who took Rachel Dorr had spent 34 years inside the very family that mourned her, had comforted her grieving mother, had carried her father's casket, the town went silent in a way it had not been since 1991. People drove past the old roller rink and just sat there. The lie every small town tells itself, that the danger always comes from somewhere else, broke open on that porch. The danger had been at the Sunday table the whole time. It had held Joan's hand while she wept. Joan Dorr was 83 years old when Dawn Petrick and a 71-year-old Gil Marsh drove out together to tell her. She met them on the porch, beneath the light she had never let go dark. When they said the words that they knew now, that they could prove it, that Howard had been arrested, Joan did not cry at first. She stood very still. Then she said the thing that none of them would ever forget. "He sat right there," she whispered, looking at her own kitchen window. He ate at my table, and he let me leave that light on for 34 years. Linley was charged with aggravated murder. He has pleaded not guilty, and the case is moving toward trial. Under the law, he remains presumed innocent of the charge until a jury decides. But for a mother who had waited her whole long life, the genetic truth closed a silence that had swallowed everything she loved. Rachel Doerr's remains were finally located that summer, after investigators questioned Linley's old movements and searched a wooded parcel he'd once had access to along the river. She came home at last. Joan buried her daughter beside her husband, and for the first time in 34 years, she turned off the porch light, because the waiting was over. I keep coming back to that broken silver clasp. To a 19-year-old who trusted the wrong familiar face, who waved off a safe ride and waited under the neon for a man she'd known her entire life. And who, in her last frightened moment, left behind the one thing that would eventually speak for her when she no longer could. She couldn't have known that the bracelet torn from her wrist would outlast her father, very nearly outlast her mother, and wait in a paper envelope in an evidence room for 34 years until the science finally caught up to what was caught in its clasp. They hid her body well. But a body is not the only thing that can testify. The truth, it turns out, is much harder to bury than a girl. There are things here worth sitting with. How does a person carry a secret like Howard Linley's for 34 years, through Sunday dinners and funerals and a grieving mother's tears, and never once break? How many other answers are folded inside old evidence envelopes right now, waiting only for the technology that can finally read them? And what does it mean that, in the end, it wasn't a confession or a witness that ended the silence, but a torn clasp and a stranger's DNA uploaded to find a long-lost cousin? If Rachel's story stayed with you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe so these cases keep finding the people who still remember the names. Tell us in the comments what you think Rachel wrote in that journal and where you're watching from. Some secrets keep for 34 years, but silence is not the same as safety, and the truth has a long, patient memory. Sometimes it waits in a broken clasp, on a bracelet a grandmother gave a girl who never took it off, for exactly as long as it takes.